My name is Pat, Emmanuel. We're cohorts in this podcast, and our goal for the whole podcast and YouTube channel is really to make science kind of mainstream, especially in these last couple of years. People seem to, depending on this topic, seem to move away from science and just kind of do their own thing. But let me know if I got this right in terms of you're studying, natural selection, but specifically when it comes to plants and sort of the survival of the fittest and how that whole system works out. Did I get that right?
Yes, I would say that's correct.
Okay, awesome. Yeah. So in terms of right now, Chris, can you explain to us what exactly you're researching on these days?
Right. So these days, I'm actually mostly studying how declines in pollinator populations, which you may have heard about, that's hit the popular press in various ways, how that may affect wild plant populations. Because, a lot of the work's been done on crops, and there's good reasons for that. We depend on pollination services for a lot of our crops. So not surprisingly, that's been a big focus of study. But in the last few years, I've gotten more interested and sort of realized that kind of my lab has the right combo of kind of skills and interests and all of that to try to really turn to wild plant populations and, not so much ask, will those populations evolve? I mean, we know things will evolve. You can see that with the coronavirus right now and the variants that are popping up. Evolution will happen as the environment changes.
Yeah.
But, we're really interested in knowing how they may evolve. So, are they going to, if pollinators decline, are we going to have, flashier flowers with more nectar and, more prominent scents? Basically, are we going to see the evolution of, types of floral traits that would basically as pollinators decline, help you compete for that sort of limited resource of pollinator visits? Or are we going to have plants just evolve to self-fertilize? Because, a lot of plants can reproduce without pollinators, right? They're able to self-pollinate. And that's, one sort of notable feature of plants. Obviously there are animals that can self-fertilize, but, in plants, because most plants are hermaphrodites and, have male and female parts on the same flower, you can get selfing without any pollinators. So that's the other possibility. It's just that we're going to evolve to see, much less flashy flowers. So small flowers, reduced rewards.
Fascinating.
Yeah. And so we're kind of curious as to, which of those possibilities is more likely? Are they mutually exclusive? Can we make any predictions about the different contexts that might push a plant population kind of in one direction versus the other?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, essentially that's what we're trying to do, is collect some data to try to be able to predict that, because it does, you can think about it in a couple ways. One way to think about it is that if, pollinators decline and plants just evolve to pollinate themselves without pollinators, to self-fertilize, then, the world's going to be a lot less flashy than it is right now, where we have all kinds of, different colors and shapes and, varieties of flowers. But, the other interesting thing is that if plants do potentially evolve just to make smaller flowers that self-fertilize more, don't make any rewards, that is going to further hurt the pollinator populations, right? Because they're putting out fewer rewards for the pollinators, less nectar, less pollen, all the things that pollinators visit plants for. And so the interesting possibility there is that you could get then, depending on what the plants do, you could get feedbacks into the pollinator population. So, that's kind of, I would say, further out. I do have a student who's looking at some of those ideas now, but yeah, that's really what we've been focused on recently. And it's been a lot of fun, and a lot of students interested in it, which is really nice. So it's we're really just getting started. It's kind of scratching the surface of it, but
Wow.
I think it's going to be something we'll keep with for a while.
Yeah.
So I'm just curious, for the audience and even myself, what are the main pollinators right now? I know bees, I guess, are the most common, right?
Yeah,
but I'm thinking, what else
that's
is
a really
considered?
That's a really good question. There's actually there's actually papers out there that are trying to, sort of estimate like how many plants are actually pollinated by animals and, what is the commonness of the different types. And there's actually a lot we still don't know. But when we talk about pollinator declines, we're mostly talking about bees, and certainly amongst insects, bees are some of the more prominent pollinators. But, there is some evidence, although I would say there's still some back and forth in the literature that, sort of invertebrate populations in general are declining. So you could imagine that other things like butterflies and moths might also be, being impacted. But most of the work that's been done on pollinator declines is really focused on bees, because most of our crops that are animal pollinated are bee pollinated, right? Your cucumbers, your squash, your apple crop, all of those are pollinated by bees. So that's really been the main focus. But believe it or not, people still debate, I actually saw a thread going around on Twitter this week about, how many species do we not know what pollinates it? And it's some, ridiculous number where we don't actually know what the pollinator is.
Interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Are you studying a specific type of plant, or you're studying kind of in general?
So I've mostly been working on for about 20 years now, actually, a plant that does grow in Southern Ontario. It's not rare, but not common. I guess that's a good way to put it. Called great blue lobelia. So it's actually closely related to cardinal flower, which a lot of people do know because it's hummingbird pollinated as red flowers. You see it all over in Ontario. This is its closely related sort of bee pollinated kin that's less common, but still around. There's populations right outside Guelph. It's planted in the Arboretum. We have populations in Hamilton and Stratford. They're around, but not super common. And yeah, so I've mostly been studying them just because, I don't know, learning a new study system is a lot of work. And so, I started studying these for different questions about 20 years ago and have sort of stuck with them. But I actually have a student now who is going to be working on a group called Mimulus, which are called the monkey flowers. And you see them more out west than here, although there's one native monkey flower in this part of the world. And she's starting to work with those because they're a plant that can definitely can both, basically you have flowers that can, depending on whether pollinators visit or not and when they visit, can either, receive pollen from another flower by the pollinator or just self-fertilize without pollinators. And so they're a better system than my great blue lobelia for kind of looking at the, again, if we think that flowers can either evolve to self-fertilize more or to attract more pollinators, and there's kind of some good reason to believe you can kind of only do one or the other. It's hard to combine both of those in a single flower. So we need a plant that can do both. And so she's starting to work on Mimulus. So we'll have to see. I'm hoping that we may start doing more work on that if that sort of works out well. But finding study systems is always a little tricky. We were using I had a student who actually published a nice paper on this a few years ago, where we, again, we're trying to look at the effects of pollinator declines on selection. And we were working with a native plant around here called Impatiens, which is called touch me not. If you touch the fruits, the seeds explode out. That's why they're called touch me nots. And so
cool.
She worked on them, but it was a terrible study system. You couldn't really grow them in the greenhouse. They didn't want to germinate. They just kind of sat there, and the seeds explosively dispersed, and they were just, I don't know what to say, literally kind of sort of floppy. And so you're trying to do things with them and they're just not very robust. So yeah, we did one paper with that and decided, well, two papers. And we were just like, okay, we need to find something else. So yeah, so I'm actually kind of at the point where I'm searching around for another study system that may work. And Mimulus may be good. I did a little bit of work on that in the past.
So is self-fertilization considered a evolutionary adaptive mechanism then, or is it the other way around? I'm wondering which came
Yeah.
first. I'm just curious, right? Because if they can do both, why does both still exist? I know that, like you said, pollinators, that seems to give more diversity, right? There's more rewards and so forth. But I mean, really, if they can just self-pollinate or self-fertilize, that might just be the way to go, where they don't have to depend on anyone.
Exactly. No. So there's actually, I mean, that's a pretty active sort of area of study in kind of plant evolutionary biology. So, we know if we look at look at flowering plants, that there's lots of cases where you can find, a couple of things, lots of cases where you find, species that, depend on pollinators for reproduction. So we could call those sometimes get called outcrossers. We see repeatedly, if you kind of look across the tree of flowering plants of all the different species, that you see species that outcross that then give rise to species that obligately self-fertilize. So they don't need pollinators at all. They have small flowers. Sometimes the flowers don't even open. They'll just basically, the petals never open up. They just self-fertilize right in the bud and just go and straight and make a fruit. And so we know that's evolved repeatedly in the flowering plants. And so, that would certainly suggest that there are conditions where that's an adaptive strategy for the plants. But, there are downsides of it. For example, you are inbreeding, you're mating with yourself, and that can have negative genetic consequences for the same reason that, we don't tend to marry our close relatives, because there's, negative genetic consequences of that, because you're more likely to get, we all carry around some negative, recessive, not good for us, sort of low fitness alleles. But if you, mate with yourself, if you're a plant or someone close to you, you're more likely to get two copies of those together and suffer the negative effects on your survival.
You might get funky looking fruit. Is that it?
Yeah, exactly. Or seeds that don't germinate, like that, different, or maybe they'll germinate, but the leaves won't have any chlorophyll, they'll be, and you'll see you can't, if they just die then.
Yeah.
So things like that. So we certainly see that. And we also see lots of plants that are what we call mixed maters. So they have traits to attract pollinators, and pollinators do visit them and pollinate them, but they also have the ability to self-fertilize. And so this is actually something that's been, people are still trying to study in terms of what maintains, why do we see plants that can do both? Why don't we see you either, totally depending on pollinators or totally selfing? And, it gets into actually genetics and ecology. There's kind of a bunch of things that go into it. But, there was an era maybe 20, 30 years ago where, people were just like, no, we shouldn't see plants that, can do both of these things, that can both self-fertilize and be visited by pollinators and fertilized by them. But that's clearly not the case now. And so now, people are trying to figure out, okay, under what conditions would you do both of these? Because that does seem like the best of both worlds. If you can open your flowers, try to get visited by pollinators, and if you don't, then you just go ahead and self-fertilize, sort of just as like a backup strategy. So, and there are plants that, seem to do that. So, plant sex is wildly kind of, there's it's all over the place. Plants do all kinds of things. So
that example right there seems like the ultimate kind of evolution where you should go, where plants should go.
Well, it's true. Survival. And then you get into interesting questions of like, well, if it's the best of both worlds, why don't all plants do it? And sort of what might prevent the evolution of that, what kind of constraints might there be on it? Under what conditions is it just not, it's pretty costly to make big flowers with lots of nectar and lots of pollen. Like that is, that's costly to the plant. And so under what conditions would you would see natural selection against that, if you don't get maybe visited by enough pollinators, or kind of that, there's kind of the costs and benefits of, having a flower that can attract pollinators versus the actual, pollen you receive in return and the pollen you export out to other plants in return.
How many genes are there in a plant? I mean, it sounds so complex. It literally, I'm kind of visualizing, they're almost like humans in a way where they're constantly adapting, right? You want to make sure, you don't have recessive genes. And literally, it's just like how we are evolving as well. So is there an idea of how many genes there are in plants?
Oh my gosh, I'm sure there is. And that actually falls a little bit outside my expertise.
Okay.
I mean, a lot.
Yeah.
Some plants have really large genomes. I mean, there's ones with smaller genomes too, but some plants have really large genomes. There's a lot of evidence in kind of the deeper evolutionary history of a lot of plant taxa that there's been basically events like in their evolutionary past where like their whole genome duplicated. So now we have like 2 copies of everything, right?
Wow.
That goes into the name polyploidy, which is a kind of crappy, hard to understand name. But, essentially, we now know, now that we can, now that we just have better genetic data for plants, the last 20 years, plants and animals, being able to sequence things, like we obviously know way more about the genome. And so it's really in that time that we've uncovered that a lot of plants, for sure, and this is true of animals also, have, in their past, they've, doubled all their chromosomes. And sometimes there's multiple events. You can actually see, that charted in their history. So, plants are pretty genetically complex. And of course, besides the nucleus, you have not only mitochondrial genes, but also genes in the chloroplasts that have to do with photosynthesis and things like that. And you get interactions between, those genes and the nuclear genes. So it's pretty complex, actually. So, plants are interesting from that front.
Yeah, I mean, I've always found plants very interesting. I mean, just even their ability to protect themselves from predators, right? They can either release, the different compounds, to scare predators away and so forth. Like, I mean, yeah, just
or to
learning
eat
about this whole
predators.
evolution.
Isn't there
or to eat
plants that
predators
like,
as well?
Yeah, right?
Yeah, there definitely are. There's different carnivorous plants that have sort of an interesting, usually they occur in really nutrient poor habitats. And so, they have adaptations to, they're costly usually to build traps and things like that, but to trap insects. So, I mean, I know there's a student in the department whose committee I'm on here who's actually studying pitcher plants up in Algonquin because they actually apparently consume a lot of salamanders. So she's studying that, which is kind of interesting. She's got some great photos of like pitcher plants with these whole salamanders that like fell in and got digested.
Oh,
That's crazy.
That's got to be a big plant.
Wow.
Yeah.
I was going to say, if there's going to be a world apocalypse, the plants will survive and they're just going to eat the humans, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it was never about the robots. It was just about the plants, never about the robots. Yeah. So what kind of trends have you seen over the last, I don't know, 50, 100 years in terms of, plants that need pollinators versus plants that can do both? Has there been a trend towards a lesser one version or?
Yeah, I'm trying to think. I mean, I don't know if we can say in that recent an amount of time what trend there's been, but there's been studies that have done things like actually try to reconstruct what the first flowering plant flower looked like. And those certainly there's lots of evidence that early on, like early flowering plants definitely had flowers with traits to attract pollinators for sure. And so that is probably in the flowering plants, at least, that is really probably kind of the ancestral situation. And then from that, over millions of years, we've had the evolution of not only kind of more, I don't know what to say, like the earliest flowers were, you don't want to use the word primitive because that's just not good practice, but they how shall I say this, like they might look a lot like a magnolia flower to you, like lots of separate petals, lots of different male and female parts. And, one thing we see over time is, both the evolution, from a big showy flower into a much smaller flower that's really just specialized to self-fertilize. But then we also see the evolution of, let's see, just, more complex flowers with more complex shapes, fewer petals, not necessarily just kind of wide open, but actually having like narrow tubes that, pollinators have to go down. Instead of being radially symmetrical, like a daisy, actually being bilaterally symmetrical. So there's only one plane you can cut them through. So that limits, the pollinator can only kind of approach the flower in one direction, as opposed to something like a daisy where a pollinator could come in, a whole bunch of different ways to get to the flower. So we definitely see, I would say, over the evolution of kind of the sweep of flowering plant evolution, you definitely see, starting with this kind of big open, I don't know what to say, very multi-parted, lots of petals, lots of male and female parts, sort of insect pollinated flower. And from that, you definitely see both, both the evolution of, kind of, I guess, really more, potentially more specialized, that's always a fraught term, but more specialized flowers, either to, to self or to have more complex shapes, essentially, which, can affect reproduction, kind of, anything, because plants, we tend to think of plants as passive because, they don't move and the pollinators visit them, but, plants have ways of trying to manipulate their pollinators also. And, some of that is evolving on, structures that make it harder to get to the nectar, or structures that, to get there, you have to brush against the male and female parts. So you have to transfer pollen. You can't just visit and take the nectar and leave. That's always a risk with pollinators. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think assuming like as the ecosystems change or the climates change, the plants also change as well in their environment, right?
Completely. Yeah. No, that's definitely true. And, plants aren't passive. They have lots of strategies for trying to manipulate pollinators, both, like I say, evolving over the long term, just more complex floral shapes that really kind of try to funnel the pollinators to where the plant wants them to go, essentially. Because, the worst possibility from the plant's perspective usually would be if you just have, an insect visits, it takes some nectar and, it just leaves, right? It doesn't transfer any pollen. It doesn't deposit or pick up pollen, or it picks up pollen and just eats it, eats it all. I mean, normally it would probably consume some of it. A lot of bees are collecting pollen for the hive. But so, plants have different ways of, manipulating that. And, also even in response to pollinator declines, I mean, one thing that some of my students have been working on recently is, we're trying to look at natural selection and make predictions over the longer term of how plants are going to evolve. But we've also just been trying to look on the short term. So, if pollinators decline, how can plants respond, really within a generation? So on very short scale. And so one thing we've been studying is, as pollinators decline, do plants keep their flowers open longer, because they have to wait around longer to get visited. And so do they keep their flowers open longer? And if they do, does that actually help them get more pollen? And does it come as a cost? Because, you have to use carbon and water and all the resources of a plant to keep a flower open and looking nice, right? That a pollinator would want to visit it. That does take resources from the plant.
Is there a lot of, I don't know if this exists or not, is there like a lot of crossbreeding between the different flowers to create new species or strains as a way of adapting? Because I know right now we've been talking about evolutionary adaptation and changing the genetics, but I'm thinking, what about just creating a totally brand new flower between two different ones? Is that common?
Certainly, yeah. I mean, breeders do this all the time, right? I mean, there's tons of work on, creating your different varieties of, all different kinds of flowers that we plant. That's definitely the case. You will see hybridization also just in natural populations. You'll see like there are barriers between species to prevent them from fertilizing each other, but they're not perfect. They're leaky, and there's situations where you can get hybrids. And there's a whole group of kind of school of thought that is really focused on hybridization and trying to figure out, like, is hybridization, is it an engine of evolution? Does it create new variation that then, evolution can act upon, that natural selection can, kind of basically winnow through? Because, we need variation for natural selection. No variation, no natural selection. And so there's a whole kind of group of people who study, hybrid speciation, and who study, the kind of what the causes and consequences of hybridization. So yeah, that's definitely out there. And again, you see it if you look at, different kind of plant breeders. I mean, obviously we mostly think of crop breeders, but there's people who, breed different varieties of, roses and tulips and all kinds of things to get different characteristics. So, and some of that is hybridization in some cases.
Yeah, if you think about it, makes total sense. Yeah.
So a lot of the changes that you're seeing right now, can you just literally just say it's because of global warming? That seems to be what's the whole media is talking about right now. Dropping pollinators because of global warming.
I mean, we're definitely at the point where there's like no doubt that both the sort of, abiotic environment, so climate, temperature, rainfall, kind of weather patterns are changing. And it's also clear that, sort of what we'd call the biotic or living environment. So, your pollinators, your herbivores, the plants that compete with you, some of which are, for example, invasive plants, and animals, that's all happening. And that is certainly affecting, that's got to be affecting the evolution of organisms that are out there. But I would say we're probably still at the early stages of figuring that out. I mean, it's really only in it's actually really only since the 1970s that, evolutionary biologists started to realize that, I don't know what to say, evolution can happen really quickly in natural populations. And that it's funny because now that's such an accepted sort of thing. Like there's, whole groups of people who study rapid evolution, as, environments change, do we see the rapid evolution of different traits, and, rapid enough to then maybe loop around and affect ecological processes. And that's really, it's a big focus of study now, but there was a period, and really it wasn't until about the 1970s where this changed, where the thought was that evolution happened so slowly in nature that you wouldn't go out and measure natural selection, because you just, it's too slow and too weak, basically, to possibly see it. And it was really multiple people contributed to it, but really the Darwin's Finch researchers, Peter and Rosemary Grant, who really went out, in the 1970s and just were able to show that, when we had this major climate event, when we had El Nino one year, and, it didn't rain. The only thing you had left were big seeds that only the big beaked finches could actually physically crack open, that you saw really within a single generation this shift in beak size,
Wow.
And that got published in Science,
really?
Because, it was showing this really kind of
crazy
fast response. Yeah. But, it was really like, that's pretty new. And now, I grew up in that kind of school of thought that, yes, we can go out, we can measure natural selection, we can manipulate the environment, we can experimentally, reduce pollinator access to try to mimic a world with fewer pollinators and see what the consequences, for natural selection. That's, really mainstream now, but it wasn't that long ago. And I think sometimes evolution still gets taught that way, as something that happens really slowly and kind of happened in the past, as opposed to we can study it in the here and now. Now, something like the COVID, epidemic is a great example of how evolution can definitely happen in the here and now. We've essentially let the virus explore the adaptive landscape, and that's why we're seeing, mutations starting to spread.
Yeah, I was gonna say there's like human evolution and like, timelines, and there's like bacteria and viruses, and there's like everything in between.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think of course we always knew that, things with extremely short generation times could evolve quite quickly, quickly enough for us to see. And there are people who studied that in labs and things like that. But I think the idea that you could go out and, look at Darwin's finches and actually see like a shift in beak size, after this, that's actually tied to a weather event, kind of putting all those pieces together was, in many ways opened up all kinds of, avenues for people to study. But like I say, I think the too bad thing, we do teach the Darwin's finch example, and, it's a great example. But I do think sometimes we still tend to teach students a little more, I don't know what to say, that evolution kind of happened in the past, and as opposed to this mindset that we can go study it now, like it is happening out there, and you can go out and study that in the very short term. But I think I got a little bit off your question. I mean, we know the environment's changing, although again, I think we're still, there's arguments going back and forth and data sets going back and forth, for example, with insect declines in general. There's data sets showing them declining and then people saying, no, maybe not. Like, I think we're still kind of shuffling through some of that. But, I think everyone would still say the environment's changing. And, I think everyone would also say that, I mean, maybe some organisms are going extinct, but, most organisms are adapting in some way or another because they're still here. And again, we know they can evolve rapidly. But I think, really studying that, there's lots of possibilities. And, again, trying to understand, I mean, we talk about climate change, but, the climate's changing, but a lot of other things are changing too. It's not just all climate. And so, I think one thing that is really interesting now is trying to understand, okay, of all of these different, weather factors and, other organisms that are all changing now, which ones are kind of having the biggest effect on the evolution of other species? Can we figure that out? How might they interact with each other? I have perhaps a new student applied to the lab who might come. And, one thing she's interested in is trying to see how pollinator declines would interact with, other things that are changing in the environment. Like, we're also seeing increases in the deposition of nitrogen, which, basically is fertilizing everything. And that has, impacts. And so she's interested in kind of looking at the two of those together. So I think, there's a lot of interesting questions to ask there and a lot of room to roam in terms of, really figuring out what is happening.
Yeah, so it feels like a lot of the changes are due to influences from humans behavior, like, human behavior or our lifestyle. But I feel like, compared to maybe like 100 years ago, right now everything's so advanced, right? We're using more fossil fuels, more technology, more of everything, more chemicals, right? I mean, we're extending the life of humans per se, right? With the advancements in healthcare and so forth, but possibly the negative side or the impact would be on plants and anything else around us. So it seems like we possibly may be accelerating the evolution of plants in a way. That's kind of how I kind of see it.
Yeah, I mean, humans, I mean, I don't know, the environment has always been changing, which I think is a hard thing for us to wrap our hands around because we tend to really imagine, like, in certainly in North America, we tend to really imagine a kind of like, this pre-settlement world that was somehow untouched. But of course, that's not true. There were people living here. They manipulated their environment. They, they burned areas. They manipulated their environment also. So I think, that's one tough thing is we tend to really think that somehow there was this past that was kind of pristine and now it's not pristine. And I don't think that's true, but certainly I don't think there's much doubt that like humans have really, certainly human mediated environmental change. Like, we've really accelerated the rate of that for sure, compared to what it would have been, with smaller human populations. And
Well, we're probably killing a lot more plants and maybe plant species than back then, right? And I'm sure there's a lot of plants that haven't been studied even yet and that have died off.
No, that is true. That is true. And I mean, there's interesting work that's been done. For example, if you look at natural populations, like, fish stocks that we go out and harvest wild fish stocks. And, there's people who've looked and seen that, basically we're causing the evolution of smaller fish because we're always culling out the bigger individuals when we fish, right? And so we're actually causing the evolution of smaller fish. And I know there's been there was a cool study where people actually looked at ginseng plants, which, they can get grown as a crop, a very specialty crop sometimes, but a lot of ginseng is just collected in, they grow out in the wild and there's collectors. And there was a student down in, I think, West Virginia who did a cool study where basically they actually sent collectors, they hired collectors and sent them out and had them find ginseng plants, but not actually harvest them, and basically showed that if they had given which plants they found and if they had harvested them, they would have basically caused natural selection for smaller ginseng because it was the big ones that they tended to see and harvest.
Interesting.
So so we're certainly doing that for sure.
Our world is just so connected. It's just crazy. One behavior can spur on so many consequences that we may or may not even be aware of. But that's another perfect example of how our actions have effects and consequences, right? Good or bad.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
Yeah.
What about the other way around? So, like Pat just mentioned, our actions have consequences, but what about the other way around where the plants, the way they evolve, have a consequence on us? I'm not sure if that kind of makes any sense, or if anyone even bothered looking at that. Because
one day there's going to be like a man-eating plant that's going to just start eating humans. And just,
I like that idea.
The hell with these people.
I mean, I guess the obvious with plants would be like, the production of like oxygen or something like that, But
that's
the obvious.
true.
But other things like probably we just haven't really studied, so we're just not aware of it, I think, and.
I mean, if you look at things like, wildfires out west, I mean, plants have adaptations, for example, to burn, and that certainly has consequences for us. That's definitely the case. I'm trying to think. I mean, certainly, the rise of plants and, the fact that they, produce oxygen was, kind of a huge event in the history of, the earth. There's no doubt about that.
The rise of plants. I like that. I'm sure there's a book written about that where the plants take over the world in the future. The rise of plants.
Well, my colleagues that study non-flowering plants would give me a hard time, but certainly kind of the rise of, the flowering plants was just a huge, pretty huge event for
plants versus zombies, right? Isn't there a game or something?
Plants versus zombies.
Yeah, there you go. When there's the end of the world, it's gonna be plants and zombies surviving.
Hey, not far from the truth. Who knows? Yeah. What's the most fascinating thing that you've learned in your research over the last, 20 years? You said like something that you're, that kind of pretty much turned upside down what you thought.
I think probably the coolest thing was, one of the plants that I study has basically, they have, if you look at the plants, some individuals, the flowers have both male and female parts, and some individuals have only female parts. So you can actually sex the plants. Like I can look at it and say, you're a hermaphrodite, you're a female, there's no males, but basically that's the case. And we actually did some work. I'm an undergrad in my lab, 6 or 7 years ago now. And we got basically some indirect evidence that the female plants could tell whether their neighbors were hermaphrodites. We think it's because the floral, like the pollen has its own scent.
What?
And that the females could actually, yeah. So we published one paper, and then we published sort of a former student of mine who studies floral scent. We sort of published kind of almost like an opinion paper saying, there's lots of evidence out there that, for example, if say an herbivore attacks one plant, it releases chemicals, and then the neighboring plant can detect those, that scent, basically.
Like the female.
And well, yeah, in that case, they can, basically like put in place their own anti-herbivore defenses. So we know that plants can communicate, right, by releasing different sorts of scents. And the one that's been really well studied is herbivory. So, but we actually realized we had some evidence that they may also be able to detect basically, what other flowering plants are around them. So in our case, we think the females can tell whether they're surrounded by hermaphrodites and open more flowers because there's lots of potential mates making pollen right around them.
Oh, so I need a cologne with that scent thing. I need to get my hands on that.
So that was a really surprising result. And, we actually kind of whacked our head against the wall for months trying to understand, like, okay, the females are opening more flowers. Why are they doing this? Like when they're surrounded by hermaphrodites, then when they're surrounded by females, why are they doing this? Like, how are they doing this? They did it even when we hand pollinated them. So they didn't have any kind of cue as to what their whether they were getting well pollinated or not. Even if we pollinated them ourselves and everyone got pollen, they still were doing this. And we kind of whacked our head against the wall for months. And then my undergrad was giving a presentation, and I remember going in like at night. It was like at 9 at night, which is not normally when I'm in campus. I was a small kid. I'm not then there, but I went in to see her talk, and she talked about it. And, there's someone in our department who studies like salamander pheromones. And he was just like, well, okay, the plants were in pots, right? And we're like, yeah. He's like, okay, so the roots can't be talking to each other because they were all separate. And he's like, well, do plants make pheromones? And I'm like, well, yeah, of course they do. Like plants, that's the reason you can smell your tomatoes and the scent of fresh cut grass. That's all plant volatiles being released. And so it was pretty funny because that was the moment where I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah, right. Put that in a bottle.
Like, at least the hypothesis. Yeah. So I emailed my former student and was like, could this be the case? And so we actually we measured floral scent, but the data are still, I don't know, my former student's still working on them. She's out a faculty member at the University of New Brunswick now. Oh, but I think that was the most surprising thing, was some evidence that like basically plants might be able to use floral scent to figure out who's flowering around them and, adjust their own phenotype in response.
There you go, Chris. That might be a $10 billion business idea for you. Yeah. I'd patent that right away.
So yeah, so I think that had to be the most surprising for sure. And, and I certainly feel like I still remember sitting there and like, the salamander pheromone guy. And I was like, wait a minute. But it's also a great reminder why you have to, it's really, and I always give my students this line, it's really important to hang around people who do different things than you, because you never know what you're going to pick up on. And of course, as soon as he said it, I was like, of course. Because again, there's tons of work that's been done with herbivory where, there's lots of evidence that, one plant gets attacked by an herbivore and the other plant can detect that based on, essentially when they get damaged, the leaves release all kinds of volatile compounds that, more or less yell, we're getting attacked. And, the other plants can pick up on that. So we were sort of like, well, why shouldn't this work for other, why not floral scents? Like, should work.
Similar idea. Yeah.
Wow.
Very cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. That was definitely the most surprising thing. So kind of a byway of research. I didn't end up kind of going full bore into it, but it was pretty cool.
I'm surprised that your colleague hasn't like provided you with some salamander pheromones just to spray on your flowers and see what happens,
No, it's definitely true. But, it's another good reminder that, plants can communicate in lots of ways and in lots of I don't know what to say, the secret lives of plants kind of, I don't know what to say, slightly new agey ways. Like really they have lots of mechanisms for doing it. And of course I should have known that, but I don't think it was until I did this particular experiment and got this kind of odd result that I could not figure out what might be going on that I kind of realized that.
Do you want to share with us any other ways that people can get in touch with you and check out your research?
www.ChristinaMarieCaruso.com. It's my full name. What can I say? And it was available.
Yeah. Well, you're doing fascinating work at one of the world-renowned universities, University of Guelph, renowned for this type of research and agriculture.
Lots of plant biology here.
Yeah.
No, it's true.
Yeah.
The ag school.
So you're at the right place, definitely. So we thank you so much, Chris, for your time.
Great. Okay, fabulous. Well, thanks a lot. It was a lot of fun. I don't get to talk kind of informally about this, so.
Yeah, this is great.
Yeah, I never imagined I would have talked an hour straight about plants, but thank you. It's been very enlightening.
I don't know about you, Pat, but I'm starting to get hungry. I want to eat some
salad. Yeah, let's go.
I gotta be honest. I wanted to work on birds, and I think I realized that I was a terrible birder, but that plants didn't move around, and that was like, I was like, okay, I can deal with this. At least
the plants will fly away, right? Most of the do is just wither away.
They do not. No, I did in fact realize that that I was maybe more cut out for plants than other things.
All right. Well, good luck with your research.
So much, Chris.
Thank
Take
you.
care, Chris.
Have a good afternoon.
You too.
Thank you too.
All right. Take care. Bye.
Take care. Thank you.